Is it just me or is America starting to lose its edge? What I mean by that is it feels like whenever another year rolls around, there's another country that overtakes the US in one industry or another. From car manufacturing in the 80s to artificial intelligence today, it's no longer obvious that America is the reigning global leader in a variety of different industries. By the way, I think innovation around the world is great. We can use more competition and Americans do benefit from it. However, there's one industry in particular in which the US is the undisputed global champion, and that is biotechnology and biopharmaceuticals. According to the Global Biotechnology Innovation Scorecard, which takes countries around the world and rates them from 0 to 100, which is the perfect score, on a variety of metrics that seek to measure the country's ability to foster an economy or ecosystem that really promotes innovation and new development, well, you might be a little surprised by the results. Japan, for example, which is a traditional powerhouse in the industry, gets a score of 46. Similarly, the United Kingdom, also another strong player, gets a score of 53. China, despite its astounding level of technological progress in so many different areas, gets a score of 26. However, the United States, well, it scores at 80. But I don't think that this score differential actually does justice to how much superior the US system is at fostering innovation in this area, based off of all the evidence in front of me. But the question remains, why is the US so much more superior in this regard? Why haven't other countries been able to match or at least come close to the US's level here? And it's a complex question, and frankly, the answer is very complicated. There's no easy explanation per se. But one area I think is a critical driving variable in this equation, and that has to do with incentives. Simply put, I think that the United States incentivizes innovation in this area better than others. Why is this important? Well, it costs between $1 to $2 billion to get a drug from the clinical pipeline to the pharmacy. And it takes 10 years to do that. And on top of that, there's no guarantee that once it has gotten the regulatory approval and it's officially marketed, that this new drug will have a lot of patient or doctor demand. And as a result, there's a lot of times drugs that get approved at great cost and at great time, they get pulled from the shelves soon thereafter because it just didn't sell as well as they thought. And that's a really expensive way to find out whether there's a market demand for your product. Therefore, why would investors or companies want to invest in something like this? Because it's so hard and expensive. While it's good for the world, after all, we could all use a new therapy for cancer rather than another TikTok knockoff. Why would anybody want to do this from an investor point of view? And to be honest, they shouldn't unless they get properly incentivized. And the United States, I believe, does this better relative to other countries. In the US, in short, companies get a bit of monopoly pricing power for a period of time shortly after their drug gets approved to go on the shelves or go in the pharmacy. And this makes a huge difference because during this limited period of time, companies are able to recoup all of these expenses that they incurred over the period of development and ideally make a reasonable profit that motivates them to invest more in even new therapies. However, we all know where this is going. America has notoriously high drug prices. Some of these drug costs are just astronomical. So some gene therapies, which are at the cutting edge of innovation, can cost over $1 million. Who has money for that? Well, it seems like the US healthcare system does, one way or another. So as a result, there's lots of conversation among the left traditionally, but especially on the political right these days, to start reining in these ridiculous drug prices. However, I want to talk about all of this today with a true expert on the matter, Dr. Jonathan Darrow. My name is Henri Mattila. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoy the forthcoming conversation as we attempt to scratch the surface of this topic. An expert in the area where law, innovation, and the pharmaceutical industry intersect, Jonathan is an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and a faculty member at the school's Center for Bioethics. Prior to that, among a number of other accomplishments, Jonathan served as a senior law clerk at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit and has worked in private practice at the law firms Cooley and Wiley. Jonathan, it's a pleasure to speak with you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So I want to begin by asking you, what are your thoughts on the claim that this friendly U.S. drug pricing regulatory regime is one of the, or if not the driving factor of innovation within the biopharma industry?
Well, certainly having the ability to charge an unlimited amount of money would be an incentive for any business. There could as well be a number of other factors, such as the robust venture capital market in the United States that also contribute the substantial amount of money that is funded through the National Institutes of Health and other government organizations that provide basic research funding that can then be picked up by industry, as well as certain laws that allow private industry to patent and profit from inventions that at the early stage were originally funded by the government. So those are a few sources that I might cite, or a few reasons that I might cite for why the US has strong innovation in the biotech sector.
Got it. And I think it's perhaps not totally appreciated what you touched on about the level of investment that the United States government provides into basic R&D that then these pharmaceutical companies leverage. And is it true that the government, so while the US the taxpayer is funding this research used by drug manufacturers and so forth, do the drug manufacturers have to pay any royalties or anything like that to the government?
There is a law called the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act that governs the relationship between public funding and the ability of private entities to patent and profit from the research that was funded by that money. And that does reserve some rights to the federal government, including the right to make and use the invention. Although the government rarely, if ever, uses those rights, I think in part because they're concerned that if the ability to profit is undermined by government use, that it would deter collaboration or willingness to accept government funding in the future. But there are rights that the government has vis-a-vis the inventions that it funds.
Okay, but at least from what I understand, the government it's not very aggressive, and as you mentioned, in collecting the fees that might be owed if it had been a private partner providing research.
Right. So in terms of an actual royalty paid to the government, that is something that had been proposed, but I don't believe that's ever been enacted into law. So that there's no obligation to pay the government royalties out of the profits that flow from government-funded inventions under the Bayh-Dole Act. Instead, the rights held by the government are in the form of a fully paid up license for the federal government to use the invention, and also the ability to what's called a march-in right, to march in and make sure that the invention is being used if the company that has the rights to use it is not adequately developing it for and making it accessible to the public.
Got it. And taking a step back, looking at the private sources of funding, you mentioned that one of the areas that sets the US apart in this world of biotech innovation is the robust capital markets in the form of venture capital. And isn't it the case that the very reason that the VC funding landscape exists in the US to begin with is that they are able to, in theory, be able to cash out one day very handsomely in case one of these investments become successful in the form of an approved therapy, and thereby that's closely linked to the fact that they are able to charge high prices for the drug to begin with, to make the drug very profitable for these early stage investors.
I think that's true. Venture capitalists certainly expect a high rate of return on average, although certainly some of their investments fail to produce any return at all. And so the ones that do produce a return, they're expecting quite a high return in order to justify their investment at all. One other important aspect, I think, of the question that you're raising is, to what extent is the US market separate from the rest of the world? And to some extent, it is a single market. If you create a product, you can try to extract revenue around the world. So I don't know that all of the factors that I mentioned would necessarily fully explain why the US market has been so robust. It could also depend on certain other factors, such as the presence of lots of institutes of higher education where foundational research occurs, combined with the government funding that we mentioned earlier, combined with a tradition of entrepreneurship, all of that in this context where people can profit through the patent system. But then once those inventions are made, they can be used to generate revenues not only in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. So it is, to a great extent and to an increasing extent, a single global market for pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, and granted, that's why it's I think a bit of a mystery. Why is the United States still such a leader? It's Japan and Europe. There's no shortage of research institutions and lots of capital, human and otherwise, flowing into the space. But you do have to take a look at the American biotech space, where you have these early stage companies, and a lot of them are actually funded by immigrants from Europe in particular, or from China, which makes you wonder that maybe there is something in the system here that makes America really conducive to founding these types of companies and raising capital. And on a similar token, I know within the industry, when they talk about, like you mentioned, it really is a global market, right? You have a drug, no matter where it's developed, in theory, you can sell it then anywhere, or sell the rights to anywhere. A rule of thumb employed by some companies, some pharmaceutical companies in the industry, is to measure the profits that you'll get from this compound to be 50-50, meaning US represents 50% of the profits, the rest of the world combined represents 50%. The United States, for comparison, makes up 5% of the world's population. And that's very crude estimate, but regardless, it does suggest that for drug companies, anywho, the United States is the golden goose.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. The large share of profits comes from the United States. In part, that's due to the factor that you mentioned, that there are no price caps on drugs in the United States, at least as a general matter. But again, you could be a company that starts in China or India or any other country and choose to sell your product in the United States and still have access to that market. So I don't know that fully explains why more companies originate in the United States. Is And that's, a statistic that you cited at the beginning that I'm not necessarily familiar with. What I can say is there has been an increasing importance in terms of innovation in other countries and other regions of the world. So you mentioned China as an important area of growth. China has become important, particularly in the active pharmaceutical ingredient market. That's the base ingredient, the active ingredient in the drug that is produced, possibly sold to another country, such as India. India has become increasingly important in creating finished drug products. So they might take an active ingredient, put it into a pill, and then sell that pill to another company that packages it and sells it as an end product. India has become an increasingly important player particularly since the 1995 TRIPS agreement, under which it undertook to create intellectual property rights. The TRIPS agreement is the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. It is a World Trade Organization agreement that all World Trade Organization members must adhere to. And so now any company anywhere in the world can go to India and patent its new medicine. This was not retroactive, did not apply to medicines already in existence, but going forward, you now have similar protections in India that you would in other countries. So India has become sort of the generic drug manufacturer of the world. Latin America has also risen in importance in terms of not just the number or types of drugs, but research. If you look at academic articles, there have been an increasing number of academic articles in the pharmaceutical space or pharmaceutical related spaces, there's been similar increases in other parts of the world as well. So there's reason for optimism, and I think reason for increasing democratization of pharmaceutical innovation. It's not clear that the United States will necessarily retain its #1 spot, or how long it will retain that, or to what extent it will retain that.
Yeah, it is pretty fascinating. I'm aware of that, the fact that India is really the, kind of how people know that China manufactures everything from, our microchips to, textiles. India has slowly, or rather rapidly since the 90s, become the de facto manufacturer of the world. And I think it was the case that, a lot of the COVID vaccines, they came from India as well, which ironically, a lot of the Indian population itself didn't get early access to, because the customers usually came from Western countries, but I suppose that's a different conversation. And, but now, speaking about more domestic policy, it's the Inflation Reduction Act was recently signed into law by President Biden, and this is a really, massive bill that touches all kinds of areas, and maybe that's why it's so curiously named. But one area there really concerns the biopharmaceutical industry, and anybody, working in healthcare or being a beneficiary of it. Most notably, it allows the US government, for the first time ever, to start negotiating prices on behalf of Medicare, which is one of the largest, if I believe the largest purchaser of prescription medications for some of the most common drugs. This won't start immediately, and it's not a full sweep. I think it starts in 2026 for 10 drugs and then move on to 15 and 20 drugs, then, a couple of years later. But still, that marks a massive change. And I'm curious, what do you make of that new change in policy and direction?
So I have not looked at that law in detail, so I can't comment specifically on the language of the law. But there are a couple things I can say in general. One is that even prior to that law, the individual plans under Medicare were already able to negotiate prices. So there was no prohibition on negotiation. It was simply that the Medicare as a whole could not negotiate on behalf of its plans. So the negotiation at the higher level of Medicare, in theory, will give it more leverage. And I think advocates of that position have hoped that will allow the government to reduce its expenditures on medicines. I think that may be overly optimistic. And in part, the reason is because whenever you negotiate, there has to be a basis for negotiation. There has to be some alternative. what happens if I decide that the price the other party is going to pay is too high? Having a large volume gives you a powerful negotiating position if you can walk away. If you can say, the price is too high, I'm not going to buy it. However, under US law, there are requirements that Medicare cover certain prescription drugs. There's actually a list of 6 categories where Medicare essentially must cover those drugs, regardless of cost. So no matter how big you are, if you can't walk away from the table, it's not clear that that negotiation will result in a lower price than what would have occurred under the negotiation that happened prior to this law. So that would be one of my big concerns for those who've advocated negotiation by Medicare as a panacea for drug prices.
That's interesting, and I haven't read the law super clearly, but I do know that there are since it's a negotiation. That's the term that's used, and you mentioned it's not it's not a pure negotiation in the sense of lack of basis. However, on the private sector side, the suppliers, the pharmaceutical companies, if they choose not to enter into the negotiation and they say, nope, I'm not going to get into that, they're going to be faced with a tax penalty, which seems to be non-trivial. So in a way, it's it's not a negotiation as how we think about it in the private sector. It's more of a weird hybrid where I suspect the government will have the upper hand. That's been my reading of it anyway.
I don't know. That could be the case. If there's a tax penalty, and I'm basing this just on what you said just now, it sounds like that would force them to the table to negotiate, but it doesn't sound like that would necessarily produce any particular result, which is really the important part from a price standpoint.
Got it. So yeah, I know the industry had fought quite hard against it, and I believe they think that this is going to be a slippery slope toward a model that we see in other countries such as Canada, where the government negotiates for everything, and that guarantees pretty good prices for patients, certainly, but perhaps not too favorable for the pharmaceutical companies.
Right, and as you mentioned earlier, if a company is generating the majority of its revenue, or at least 50%, I think was the figure used, from the United States, no matter where it's located, if the potential revenue and the potential profits drop, that certainly could have an effect on willingness to invest, and then the number and types of the products that result. Now, no one knows exactly how big that impact would be, but there is a concern that there would be a reduction in innovation. Right now, although the US funds much of that innovation through the higher prices that it pays, the benefits of that innovation redounds to the world as a whole. So in some sense, the world is free riding on the profits of the United States, and having a more level playing field, it could be something that would be considered more equitable. Now, whether you want to increase the ability of companies to generate profits in other countries or reduce its ability in the United States, right, those are two different ways to achieve that level playing field, each with different potential implications. Let me just say also, related to the last point that you raised about the high drug prices in the US, we have a system here that is internally inconsistent. And I think this is one of the most important factors in explaining high drug prices. On the one hand, we view healthcare as a right. And so we have insurance that helps pay for drugs. And the whole point of insurance is to make sure that if someone can't afford the drug, they can get it anyway because they're insured. And that guarantees, from the perspective of a patient, access to medicines. That's the benefit. From the perspective of the company, that guarantees that volume won't decrease. And this is business 101. If you know that you can raise the price and volume won't decrease, why would you not raise the price? So we have this free market system of pricing, the socialist system of paying for drugs. We're trying to do both. We're in this straddling position where we haven't committed to one or the other. We're trying to make everyone happy. And the result is entirely predictable. Prices are going to and have risen dramatically. And that's what I think is going to keep happening unless we try to unify the approach so it's more of one or more of the other. And the step that you mentioned just a moment ago of increased negotiation by Medicare is maybe one small step in the direction of stepping away from the free market and stepping toward the socialist side of the equation. That may be one way to resolve the problem, the issue of high prices. The other way would be to go in the entirely other direction and have an entirely free market system. So I'm not going to take a position on which of those ways to go is better, but if we continue the straddling position, I would predict that the prices will continue to skyrocket.
I see. That's really interesting to hear. You're saying that the biggest flaw here isn't necessarily that the U.S. is too maybe free market oriented, but rather it's still, given our the friendly regulatory regime, it remains far too socialistic in the government mandate, and it's true. That's what makes the U.S. system, I think, really confounding to any foreign analysts, because there's really no other system quite like it. I think most other systems are very on the more socialistic side, as you put it. And we've been talking a lot about drug prices as they pertain to drug company policy and innovation and so forth. But I know the industry, they will make the claim that yes, drug prices are high, and yes, they have been pricing by a great extent in some cases. But the net price, the price that's actually paid by the consumer, that's different from the gross price. And we have this, and this comes down to the confusing nature of our system. We have these middle managers called pharmacy benefit managers, effectively, and they're supposed to negotiate the price on behalf of the insured, and in theory lower the costs for them. However, the industry claims that they're not actually lowering costs; they're pocketing the difference themselves. And I'm curious if you have a view on that.
Yeah, so I think that, one of the challenges of the U.S. system is that it is so complicated. It is difficult for the free market to work. You don't know, on the one hand, how much drugs actually cost, as you mentioned, and this comes up in the literature where you see claims made about trends in drug prices, but they use the list price, they don't use the actual price. And so you have to take the conclusions of those papers with a grain of salt, because you don't know. You don't know what the actual data show. At the same time, you don't know the benefits of the drug. These are not clearly disclosed. They're not frequently discussed. We have a yes or no system. Either a drug is effective or it isn't effective. Right? Imagine if you went to the gas station and you said, give me some gas, I don't care how much, and you can charge me whatever you want. You don't have to tell me how much. If you don't know how much it costs, you don't know how big the benefit is, it's very difficult for the free market system to work in that context. And it doesn't work very well. It has not worked very well. I think it's right that the drug prices have not risen as dramatically as some of the headlines state, for the exact reason that you mentioned. We have rebates, we have other ways to disguise discounts. And the result is really this, to me, this is really an issue of transparency. We don't have adequate transparency in the market. Without transparency, how can a market function? So what I would love to see legislators do is mandate increased price transparency. That's easy to say. How to carry it out in practice would be potentially challenging.
You may be more aware of this, but didn't the Trump administration have something like this? They made an effort to require, I think, in the hospital setting, if I recall correctly, to provide transparency. I'm not sure if that bore any good fruit, but are you aware of that effort?
Yeah, so I think it was a regulation that came into effect maybe a year and a half ago or so, and it required hospitals to disclose what's called the charge master, the list of prices that they charge. Unfortunately, at the time that we looked at this, at least, which was maybe 6 months after it was implemented, a large share of hospitals had not complied with the law. So they were simply not disclosing, or not yet disclosing. Now that may have improved. I don't know the absolute latest on that, but I think it's certainly a step in the right direction. hospitals are one place where high drug prices are especially non-transparent, because you get a hospital bill and you don't know how much of the drug price was from the manufacturer and how much of it was a markup from the hospital. There is an industry-funded study that claims that more than half of the cost of hospital-administered drugs are hospital markups. Now, they don't tell you which drugs they are. They don't tell you very much about where the data comes from. But if that's true, that provides a very different picture of who is profiting from drugs in the United States. And keep in mind that although drugs have traditionally been distributed through pharmacies, the increasing use of biologics, which generally have to be administered in a healthcare setting, means that there is a larger and larger share of the market of drugs that is being administered in hospitals, potentially with these, not only the hospital charge for the services that you get, but a markup for the drug itself.
Yeah, and I think that's, to me, that sounds like the obvious starting point. I know you mentioned that there are no easy fixes here, but thinking as a consumer, we can all relate to that, the phenomenon of buying literally anything else, whether it's your next iPhone or a car. Any consumer in the country will be able to list out their whatever X many alternatives, the price range, and then how much they're willing to pay for given the quality of whatever item they receive. Healthcare, in theory, which is the area where we probably spend the most amount of money, except for potentially, you're buying a home, we don't think that way. And that has downstream effects everywhere else, where hospitals can charge, gosh, I've seen numbers like five times more for a colonoscopy in one hospital, same colonoscopy than somewhere else. And it's just, it's really beguiling, really. But, it doesn't just look, listening to the conversations, it just doesn't seem like there is too much progress being made in that front, or even agreement that this is something that we should pursue.
So there has been some progress made on the issue of transparency and drugs. So we have a relative newcomer, I guess it's several years old now, in the drug pricing space called GoodRx. And this is a private company. See, you're nodding, so maybe you're familiar with this.
Yes.
And any person in any doctor's office, I think some doctors do this, you can type in the name of a drug and see what it will cost at local pharmacies. So that's very useful to price compare based on the cash price of the drug. Now, it gets a little more complicated if you have insurance and you have to think about the copay and stuff like that. And this doesn't work for hospital administered drugs, as I mentioned. But that is what I think is a substantial advance in transparency for drug prices. The healthcare prices are an entirely different story, and maybe we'd need another hour to talk about that. But transparency in healthcare is abysmal, and we need much more attention of legislators in that area.
Yeah, and I suppose we'll have to schedule another conversation to talk about overall healthcare pricing. And but yeah, in the realm of drug pricing, yeah, a GoodRx I'm familiar with, and I think for anybody who's ever used it, they can attest to it being really amazing, because you can really see. You type in any drug name, generic name for the drug, and you can see the list of prices that are being offered by various pharmacies, and the difference can be huge. And you wouldn't probably have that information otherwise without the use of this tool. And I'm curious, I wondered why did GoodRx take so long to even come about, and how is it legal?
I don't know the answer to that question, and I'm actually not sure where they get their data on prices. So those are maybe some questions to raise with the folks over at GoodRx. I imagine they'd be happy to speak with you.
Yeah.
There is one limit to GoodRx and a solution that I'd like to mention, and that is that GoodRx, I don't think, is very good at helping you discover lower priced alternative medicines that could be substituted for the drug of choice. So it's great at comparing the price of a single medicine across different pharmacies, but if your doctor could have prescribed a different drug but didn't, it's less good at that. And the solution that we have proposed, and that this isn't really a matter for Congress, but for state legislators, is granting greater authority to pharmacists to substitute alternative drugs. Of course, doctors can do this already. If doctors are aware of the high price of a particular drug, they could, if they have the time and the knowledge, substitute alternative medicines. Often they may not know the price that the patient faces. Pharmacists, though, do, because they have that information when you go to purchase the drug. And in theory, they could suggest, and some states have allow pharmacists greater freedom to do this, to suggest to the patient an alternative product. Now, you may have to go back to the physician and get authorization. It really depends on how the law is written. But it's this wonderful underutilized resource we have in our healthcare system. We call them pharmacists. They have tremendous knowledge of drugs. They have much more training in pharmaceuticals than doctors, obviously, because that's all they do is drugs. And it would be great to see legislators consider granting those pharmacists, it doesn't have to be unfettered discretion, but greater discretion to substitute. So let's say small changes, something like maybe the physician prescribes a combination product that's very expensive, but the individual components are cheap generics. And the pharmacist could substitute those identical generic products as two separate pills rather than as a combination pill, obviously with notice to the patient, maybe possibly with notice to the physician as well. And in some cases, this could save quite a lot of money.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. I never heard of that idea. So, but it sounds like this is something that you think is, people are talking increasingly about perhaps enacting into some kind of new policy.
I have not seen a lot of discussion. This was a paper that I wrote with some colleagues. We're not the only ones, but it's by no means as widespread a discussion as there has been with, for example, Medicare negotiation.
Interesting, but perhaps that's something that will be a new idea add into this mess that we call the American drug pricing regime. But in the interest of time, Jonathan, it's really been a pleasure speaking with you today. I know we have a little bit of a time cap here. I know we only scratched the surface and went all over the place, but it was really interesting to hear your take and some of your ideas based off the work that you do in particular in this space. And I think our readers and listeners will, greatly benefited from your input. So thank you.
All right, thank you.